What would you do if the one destined to stand beside you looked into your eyes and told you that you were not enough, that your spirit was too broken, your wolf too silent, your worth too small to bear his mark and share his throne? Would you crumble beneath the weight of that rejection, or would you rise from the ashes of your shattered heart and show him exactly what kind of monster he created when he cast you aside? There was a woman once, in a time when wolves ran wild through ancient forests and kings ruled with claws as sharp as their cruelty, who was rejected by the alpha she was born to belong to, humiliated before his court, and left to rot in the shadows of a kingdom that had no use for the weak. But when that same king sent his most feared warriors to silence her forever, she did not beg for mercy or flee into the night like a frightened prey animal. Instead, she tore through them like a storm of teeth and fury, leaving their broken bodies scattered across the earth as a message written in blood and bone. And when the dust settled and the screams faded into the wind, everyone knew that she was far from finished with her vengeance. But what kind of power does a woman need to possess to slaughter the finest killers a kingdom has ever trained? And what will she do when she finally stands before the king who threw her away? Before we continue, kindly subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from.
Your weakness is a stain on our pack. I won't carry you any further.
The great hall of the Stofong kingdom smelled of burning pine and roasted meat, and the wolves who filled it wore their human skins like thin disguises over the beasts that lived beneath their flesh. Torches blazed along the stone walls, casting dancing shadows across the faces of warriors and elders who had gathered to witness what should have been a sacred union, a bond that would tie two souls together for all the days they would walk this earth and beyond. The ceiling stretched high above them, carved from the living rock of the mountain itself, and every surface was decorated with the bones and pelts of creatures that had fallen to the claws of Stofong hunters over countless generations. The air was thick with anticipation, and the musk of wolves barely contained human forms, and the energy in the room crackled like lightning about to strike. But instead of joy, there was only silence, thick and suffocating, as the woman standing in the center of the hall felt the eyes of the entire pack burning into her skin like hot coals. Her name was Zephira, and she had been raised to believe that the gods themselves had woven her fate into the life of the man who now stood before her with a face carved from ice and disgust. She had grown up in the lower quarters of the kingdom, daughter of a warrior who had died defending the borders and a mother who had passed from sickness before Zephra had seen her 10th winter. She had been raised by the pack, fed and clothed by the collective, but never truly belonging to anyone, always existing on the edges of things, always watching from the shadows while others laughed and loved and lived with the freedom she could only dream of. Her wolf had always been quiet, a gentle whisper in her mind rather than the roaring presence that most pack members carried, and because of that quietness, she had been labeled weak, fragile, something less than what a true wolf should be. But none of that had mattered when the bond had snapped into place on her 18th winter, when she had felt the pull toward the Alpha King so strongly that it had nearly driven her to her knees. When she had known with absolute certainty that he was hers and she was his. His name was Kale, and he was the Alpha King of Stofong, a wolf so powerful that his roar could shake the mountains and his claws could tear through stone as easily as a blade through water. He was tall and broad, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, and every woman in the kingdom had whispered his name with longing and hunger since the day he took his father's throne at the age of 20. His father had been a brutal ruler, a king who had expanded their territory through blood and conquest, and Kale had inherited not only his throne, but also his ruthlessness and his unshakable belief that strength was the only thing that mattered in this world. He had led raids into neighboring territories, had brought back spoils and captives, had proven himself in battle so many times that no one dared question his right to rule. But Zephra had never needed to whisper his name with longing, because the bond between them had been there since the moment she came of age, a pull in her chest that told her he was hers and she was his. A connection that should have been celebrated and honored by the entire pack. The elders had confirmed it, had performed the ancient rituals that revealed the threads of fate connecting two souls, and they had declared before the entire kingdom that Zephra was Kale's true mate, chosen by the gods and bound to him by forces older than memory. The announcement had sent shockwaves through the pack, because no one had expected the great Alpha King to be mated to someone so low, so quiet, so seemingly insignificant. But the bond was undeniable, and tradition demanded that it be honored, that the mating ceremony be performed during the next full moon so that their union could be blessed by the light of the moon goddess herself. Zephra had spent the weeks leading up to this moment in a haze of disbelief and cautious hope, because even though Kale had barely spoken to her, even though his eyes had been cold and distant the few times they had been in the same room, she had told herself that the bond would change things, that once they were properly mated he would feel the connection as strongly as she did, and everything would be all right. Yet now, as she stood trembling before him in the great hall, wearing the ceremonial robes that had been prepared for her, waiting for the words that would make them one, she saw nothing but coldness in his gaze, nothing but contempt curling at the edges of his mouth. The entire pack was watching, hundreds of eyes fixed on the two of them, and the weight of their stares made her feel small and exposed, like an animal caught in a trap with no way to escape. The High Elder stood beside them, an ancient wolf with white hair and eyes that had seen more winters than anyone could count, and he held the ceremonial blade that would be used to draw their blood and mix it together. The final step in the mating ritual that would bind them forever. But before the elder could speak the words, before the ceremony could truly begin, Kale raised his hand and the entire hall fell into an even deeper silence. "You are not my mate," Kale said, and his voice was loud enough to fill every corner of the hall, loud enough to make sure that no one could claim they did not hear him reject her. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Zephra felt her heart stop beating for a moment, felt the breath leave her lungs as if she had been struck in the chest. "I do not care what the bond says or what the elders claim the gods have decided," he continued, his tone sharp and cutting, every word chosen to inflict maximum pain. "You are weak, Zephra. Your wolf is silent, barely more than a whisper in your blood, and I will not bind myself to someone who cannot even shift beneath the full moon without trembling like a newborn pup. You are an embarrassment, a mistake, and I refuse to let the other packs think that Stonefang has grown so weak that our king would accept a mate who cannot even stand beside him without looking like she is about to break." The words fell on her like stones, each one heavier than the last, and she felt something inside her chest crack open, spilling pain and shame into every part of her body. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that her wolf was there, that it had always been there even if it was quieter than the others, even if it did not roar and snarl the way his did, even if she had struggled with her shifts when she was younger. She wanted to scream that the bond was real, that she could feel it even now pulling her toward him, trying to stitch their souls together despite his rejection. But her throat had closed, and all she could do was stand there while the pack watched her humiliation unfold like a story they would tell for generations. She could see the shock on some faces, the pity on others, and worse, the satisfaction on a few who had always looked down on her and were now seeing their prejudices confirmed. "You will leave this hall," Kale continued, and his eyes were like chips of ice, cold and utterly without mercy. "You will leave this kingdom, and you will never speak my name again or claim any connection to me. I reject you, Zephira, daughter of no one, wolf of nothing. You are not worthy to stand at my side, and I would rather rule alone than let the pack believe I am weak enough to accept a mate like you. The bond means nothing if it leads me to weakness, and I will not allow the gods or fate or anything else to dictate who stands beside me on the throne." He turned then, addressing the crowd, his voice rising with authority. Let it be known that I, Kale, Alpha King of Stofong, reject this bond and cast this woman out from our territory. She is no longer a pack, no longer protected by our laws, and if she returns, she will be treated as any other rogue wolf who dares to trespass on our lands. The gasps that rippled through the crowd were like the hiss of a fire being doused in water, and Zephra felt her knees begin to buckle beneath the weight of what he had just done. Rejection was not just words, it was a severing, a tearing of something that had been woven into the very core of her being, and the pain of it was worse than any wound she had ever known. It felt like her chest was being ripped open, like invisible claws were tearing at her insides, shredding the connection that had felt so right and so certain. Her wolf, that quiet presence that had always been her only comfort, let out a howl inside her mind, a sound so full of grief and rage that it nearly brought her to the ground. The bond was screaming, writhing in agony as it tried to hold on to something that had been violently cut away, and she could feel it bleeding, could feel pieces of herself dying as the connection dissolved into nothing. But she did not fall, not yet, because even as the world tilted and the faces around her blurred into shapes without meaning, she forced herself to stay upright, forced herself to meet his eyes one last time. Her hands were shaking, her entire body trembling with the effort of keeping herself standing, but she refused to collapse in front of him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. "You will regret this," she whispered, and her voice was so soft that only he could hear it, so full of something dark and unspoken that for just a moment, she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. It was there and gone in an instant, a tiny crack in his armor of cold certainty, but she saw it, and she held on to that image like a lifeline. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold arrogance, and he turned his back on her as if she were already forgotten, as if she had never mattered at all. The guards stepped forward, their hands rough as they grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the doors, and she did not resist because she had no strength left to fight. The last thing she saw before they threw her out into the night was the face of the woman who had been standing beside Kale throughout the entire ceremony, a beautiful creature with golden hair that fell in perfect waves down her back and eyes like green jewels. Her lips curved in a smile that was equal parts triumph and cruelty. Her name was Thessalie, and she was the daughter of one of the most powerful elder families in the kingdom, a woman who had made no secret of her desire to stand at Kale's side. Zephra had heard the rumors, had known that Thessalie had been working to undermine the bond, whispering poison in Kale's ear about weakness and unsuitability, but she had not believed that it would work, had not thought that Kale would actually reject a mate bond that the gods themselves had decreed. But she had been wrong, and now Thessalie stood there with victory written all over her face, and Zephra understood that this had been planned, that Kale had decided long before this ceremony that he would reject her and choose someone more suitable to his ambitions. The doors slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the night like thunder, and she collapsed onto the cold stone steps that led down from the great hall, her body shaking with sobs that tore through her chest like claws. The bond inside her was screaming, writhing in agony as it tried to hold on to something that had been ripped away, and she did not know how long she lay there before the pain finally dulled into something she could bear. The night air was cold against her skin, and she could hear the sounds of celebration starting up inside the hall, the pack moving on from her humiliation as if it had been nothing more than a brief interruption in their evening. She lay there on the steps, bleeding from a wound that no one else could see, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. But slowly, as the hours passed and the moon climbed higher in the sky, something began to shift inside her. The grief was still there, raw and consuming, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something that had been dormant for so long that she had forgotten it existed. It was rage, pure and burning, and it filled the hollow place where the bond had been, growing hotter and brighter with every breath she took. Kale had called her weak, had thrown her away like trash, had humiliated her in front of everyone she had ever known. He had taken everything from her, stripped away her place in the pack, her identity, her future, and left her with nothing but pain and shame. But he had also made a mistake, because he had left her alive, and now, as she pushed herself up from the steps and looked back at the Great Hall one last time, she made a promise to herself that she would make him understand exactly what he had done. She did not know how yet, did not know what form her vengeance would take, but she knew with absolute certainty that this was not the end of her story. Kale thought she was weak, thought she was nothing, thought he could cast her aside and forget about her. But he was wrong, and she was going to prove it to him, even if it took her entire life to do so. She turned away from the hall, away from the kingdom that had been the only home she had ever known, and she walked into the darkness beyond the walls, her body still shaking with pain, but her heart hardening into something cold and sharp. The weak little wolf he had rejected was gone, burned away by his cruelty, and in her place, something new was being born, something that would make him wish he had never spoken her name. What does a rejected mate become when the pain of humiliation turns into a fire that cannot be put out, and how far will she go to make the one who broke her pay for every moment of suffering he caused? The forest beyond the kingdom was a place of shadows and whispers, where ancient trees grew so tall their branches seemed to scrape the belly of the sky and block out the light of the sun even at midday, and the only law that mattered was the law of survival. Zephra had wandered into those woods with nothing but the clothes on her back and the rage burning in her chest, and for days she had moved through the darkness like a ghost, her body weak from hunger and her mind fractured by the pain of the severed bond. She had no destination, no plan, no purpose beyond putting as much distance between herself and the kingdom as possible, because every step away from Stofong felt like a small relief from the agony that was eating her alive from the inside. The bond had not simply disappeared when Kale rejected her, it had broken, and the breaking had left jagged edges that scraped against her consciousness with every breath, every heartbeat, every moment she continued to exist. She had tried to call to her wolf, tried to beg it to come forward and give her the strength to keep going, but it had retreated deep inside her, hiding from the agony that had nearly destroyed them both. Her wolf had always been her only true companion, the only presence that had never judged her or found her wanting, and now even that small comfort had been stripped away, leaving her more alone than she had thought possible. She stumbled through the undergrowth, her feet bleeding from cuts and her body shaking with cold and exhaustion, and there were moments when she seriously considered simply lying down and letting the forest take her, letting the predators that hunted in these woods find her and end the suffering that seemed to have no bottom. But something kept her moving, some stubborn refusal to give Kale the satisfaction of her death, some tiny spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished no matter how much pain tried to smother it. The forest was not empty, and she encountered other creatures as she wandered deeper into its heart, great bears that growled warnings when she passed too close to their dens, packs of wild wolves that watched her from the shadows with eyes that gleamed like coins in the darkness, deer that scattered at her approach as if they could smell the wrongness that clung to her like a second skin. She avoided them all, moving like a specter through the trees, barely aware of where she was going or how far she had traveled. Time lost all meaning, the days blending into nights and then back into days again, and she existed in a haze of pain and exhaustion that made everything feel distant and unreal. She ate whatever she could find, berries and roots that she dug up with her bare hands, and she drank from streams that tasted of stone and earth, and slowly, almost without noticing it, her body began to adapt to the harshness of this new life. On the seventh night, when the full moon rose fat and silver above the trees, something inside her finally snapped. She had collapsed beside a stream, her body too exhausted to move any further, and as the moonlight poured down over her like liquid fire, she felt her wolf stir for the first time since the rejection. It was not the quiet, gentle presence she had known all her life, the one that had always felt small and uncertain, always apologizing for taking up space in her mind. This was something else entirely, something wild and furious and enormous, something that had been sleeping deep inside her waiting for the right moment to wake. Her bones began to crack and shift without warning, and she screamed as the transformation tore through her body with a violence she had never experienced before, had never even imagined was possible. Every shift she had done before had been slow and careful, guided by the elders who taught young wolves how to move between forms without hurting themselves, how to embrace the wolf without losing the human. But this was nothing like those controlled transformations. This was her body tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself into something new, and the pain was so intense that she thought she might die from it. Her limbs stretched and twisted, the bones lengthening and reshaping themselves with cracks that sounded like tree branches breaking, and her skin split open in places to make way for thick black fur that erupted from her flesh like dark flame. Her spine curved and reformed, her skull reshaped itself with a grinding sound that she could feel reverberating through her entire being, and her teeth lengthened into fangs that could tear through flesh and bone with ease. She tried to scream again, but the sound that came out was not human. It was a roar of pure agony and fury that echoed through the forest and sent every living creature within miles fleeing in terror. The pain was unbearable. It was worse than anything the rejection had done to her, worse than anything she had experienced in her entire life. But she welcomed it because it meant she was still alive, still capable of becoming something more than the broken thing Kale had left behind. This pain was different from the pain of the severed bond. It was not an ending but a beginning, not a destruction but a creation, and as her body finally settled into its new shape, she felt something inside her click into place, felt a sense of rightness that she had never known before. When the shift finally finished and she stood on 4 legs instead of 2, she looked down at her reflection in the stream and barely recognized the creature staring back at her. She was massive. Larger than any wolf she had ever seen, easily twice the size of even the biggest warriors in Kale's guard, with fur as black as a starless night and eyes that burned with a silver fire that seemed to pierce through the darkness itself. Her wolf was no longer silent or small, no longer the quiet whisper that had made the pack dismiss her as weak and unsuitable. It was a beast of pure rage and power, a predator that radiated danger with every breath. And as she threw her head back and howled at the moon, the sound echoed through the forest like a promise of bloodshed. Every animal within miles fled from that sound, even the largest bears abandoning their dens and running as fast as their legs could carry them, and even the trees seemed to shudder as if they could feel the fury radiating from her. The howl went on, carrying all the pain and rage and grief that had been building inside her since the moment Kale had rejected her. And when it finally ended, the forest was silent except for the pounding of her own heart. She was no longer Zephra the weak, Zephra the rejected, Zephra the forgotten. She was something new. Something dangerous, something that would make the entire kingdom understand what it meant to cast aside a mate bond blessed by the gods themselves. The days that followed were a blur of hunting and learning as she taught herself how to move with this new body, how to use the strength and speed that had been hiding inside her all along, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. She hunted deer and brought them down with her jaws, tasted their blood on her tongue, and felt the thrill of the kill singing through her veins like the most intoxicating wine. The first kill had been clumsy, driven more by instinct than skill, But with each hunt, she became more proficient, more deadly, learning how to track prey through the forest, how to move silently despite her size, and how to strike with precision and power. Her wolf reveled in the violence, in the freedom of being untamed and unbound by the rules of the pack, and with every kill, Zephra felt herself growing stronger, more confident, more certain of what she needed to do. But hunting prey animals was not enough to satisfy the rage that burned inside her, and soon she found herself seeking out more dangerous challenges. She fought off predators that dared to challenge her territory, great mountain cats with claws like knives and jaws powerful enough to crush bone, and she tore through them with a savagery that left nothing but scraps of fur and shattered bones behind. She encountered a pack of wild wolves that tried to drive her away from their hunting grounds, and she killed their alpha in single combat, then scattered the rest of them into the wind with a roar that made them understand she was not something they could fight. Her reputation began to spread through the forest, whispered among the creatures that lived there, a warning about the massive black wolf that killed anything that crossed her path and showed no mercy to those who challenged her. The forest became her domain, her territory, and she marked it with the blood of everything that tried to stand against her. She learned to survive on instinct and fury, learned to embrace the darkness that had taken root in her heart, and with each passing day, the memory of the weak girl who had been rejected in front of the entire pack faded further and further away. That girl was dead, burned away by the fire of transformation and rage, and in her place stood a creature of pure vengeance, a wolf that existed for only one purpose: to make Kale understand the magnitude of his mistake. But the forest was not the only place where whispers of her transformation spread, because word travels fast among wolves, especially when it carries the scent of danger and death. Hunters and rogues who had heard tales of a massive black wolf moving through the woods came searching for her, some thinking she would be easy prey, others hoping to claim her as a prize they could bring back to their own packs. They found her, one by one, drawn by curiosity or greed or the simple desire to test themselves against a creature that had become a legend in the space of only a few weeks, and she made sure none of them left the forest alive. She did not kill them quickly or cleanly, did not grant them the mercy of a swift death. Instead, she made them suffer, scream, and understand that she was not something to be hunted, but something to be feared above all else. Their bodies became warnings scattered through the trees, left where others would find them and see what happened to those who thought they could challenge the black wolf of the deep forest. Some she tore apart completely, leaving nothing but blood-soaked earth and scattered pieces that the scavengers would fight over. Others she killed more slowly, breaking their legs first so they could not run, then leaving them to bleed out while she watched with those burning silver eyes, making sure they understood in their final moments that death was coming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And a few, the ones who begged and pleaded and tried to bargain for their lives, she toyed with, letting them think they might escape before bringing them down and ending them just when hope had begun to flicker in their eyes. She felt no guilt for any of it, no remorse or hesitation, because each kill was a small piece of the vengeance she was building, each death a message being sent into the world that Zephra was no longer weak, no longer broken, no longer someone who could be discarded and forgotten. Soon, the stories began to reach the edges of the kingdom, carried by survivors who had been lucky enough to witness her kills from a distance and smart enough to run before she noticed them. Tales of a monster that wore the shape of a wolf and left nothing but death and destruction in her wake. The stories grew with each telling, becoming more elaborate and more terrifying, describing a creature with eyes like silver fire and fur as black as the void between stars, a beast that could tear through a dozen warriors without slowing down, a demon that had crawled up from whatever hell rejected mates were sent to when they died. Zephra heard those stories when she ventured close enough to the villages that dotted the borders of Stonefang territory, and she smiled because she knew it was only a matter of time before Kale heard them too. And when he did, when the rumors finally reached his ears and he realized that the weak little wolf he had rejected was no longer weak at all, that she had become something far more dangerous than he could have imagined, he would have to respond. He could not ignore a threat this significant, could not let it be known that there was a rogue wolf powerful enough to terrorize his borders and kill anyone who crossed her path. His pride would not allow it, and more importantly, his position as Alpha King would demand that he deal with the problem before it made him look weak in front of the other territories. That was exactly what she wanted, because she was not going to march into his kingdom and beg for justice or forgiveness, was not going to throw herself at his feet and ask him to take back the rejection. She was going to make him come to her, going to force him to send his warriors, and when his strongest fighters arrived thinking they could end her like they would any other rogue, she was going to tear them apart and send their bodies back as a message written in blood and bone. The rage inside her had become something she could shape and wield like a weapon, something she could direct and focus, and she spent her nights planning exactly how she would make Kale suffer. How she would dismantle everything he cared about piece by piece until he understood what it felt like to have everything stripped away. She would start with his warriors, the ones he trusted to protect him and enforce his will, and she would kill them all until he had no one left to hide behind. Then, she would move on to his territory, driving away the prey animals and making it impossible for his pack to hunt, starving them slowly until they began to question whether their king was strong enough to protect them. And finally, when he was weak and desperate and completely alone, she would face him herself, and she would make him beg for the mercy he had never shown her. But how does a woman who was cast aside for being too weak become the kind of nightmare that even the bravest warriors fear to face? And what will the king do when he realizes the monster he created is coming for everything he holds dear? The elite guard of Stonefang Kingdom were not ordinary warriors. They were wolves who had been trained since childhood to kill without hesitation, to fight without fear, and to die in service to their alpha without question or regret. They were known across every territory as the King's Teeth, a name that carried the weight of countless battles and victories, and when Kale sent them into the forest to deal with the rogue wolf that had been terrorizing the borders, they went with confidence burning in their chests. There were 12 of them, each one a legend in their own right, each one marked with scars that told stories of survival and triumph, and they moved through the trees like shadows, tracking the scent of the black wolf that had become the subject of so many dark whispers. They expected to find a rogue, perhaps a mad wolf driven insane by loneliness or grief, something they could put down quickly and return to the kingdom with a trophy to lay at their king's feet. They did not expect to find Zephira. She had been waiting for them, watching from the shadows as they spread out through the forest, their movements coordinated and precise, their senses sharp as they searched for any sign of her presence. She could smell them from miles away, could hear the whisper of their breath and the soft pat of their feet against the earth, and she had chosen the perfect place for the confrontation. A clearing surrounded by ancient oaks where the moonlight fell in silver pools, and there was nowhere for them to run. She could have ambushed them separately, could have picked them off one by one as they moved through the trees, but that was not what she wanted. She wanted them to see her, wanted them to understand what they were facing, wanted them to carry the terror of this moment back to Kale, assuming any of them survived long enough to do so. So, she stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, her black fur gleaming in the moonlight, her silver eyes locked onto the leader of the group, a scarred wolf named Gorvith who had killed more enemies than he could count and had never once tasted defeat. He stopped when he saw her, his ears flicking forward in surprise, and for a moment the entire group froze as they took in the size and presence of the creature standing before them. Even in a kingdom of large wolves, Zephra was enormous, her shoulders reaching higher than a man's chest, her body rippling with muscle that spoke of raw power and deadly intent. "You are the one causing trouble at the borders," Gorvith said, his voice a low growl that rumbled through his chest, and he shifted into his human form, standing tall and unafraid even though every instinct should have been telling him to retreat. "The king has ordered us to bring you back, dead or alive. You can come willingly, or we can make this painful." Zephra let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snarl, and she shifted as well, her body flowing back into her human shape, though her eyes still burned with that silver fire. She was covered in dirt and blood, her hair wild and tangled, but there was a confidence in the way she stood that made even Gorvith hesitate. "Kale sent you to kill me," she said, her voice soft, but carrying through the night like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "He sent his best warriors because he knows that if I reach the kingdom, if I stand before him and his court, everyone will see what I have become. He is afraid of me, and he should be, because I am going to tear apart everything he has built, starting with the 12 of you." Gorvitha's expression darkened, and he signaled to the others, who began to circle around her, their eyes glowing with the light of their wolves as they prepared to strike. "You are delusional," he spat. "The king fears nothing, least of all a rejected mate who crawled into the woods to die. But if you want to make this difficult, then we will give you the death you deserve." The words had barely left his mouth when Zephra moved, and she was faster than anything they had ever seen, faster than should have been possible for any wolf. Her body a blur of motion as she shifted mid-leap and crashed into the first warrior with the force of an avalanche. The warrior's spine snapped like a dry branch under her weight, and he was dead before his body hit the ground, his eyes wide with shock and his mouth open in a scream that never had time to emerge. The others reacted instantly, their training kicking in as they spread out and attacked from multiple angles, but Zephra was already moving again, spinning away from a set of claws that would have torn through her side and closing her jaws around the throat of a second warrior, ripping it out in a spray of blood that painted the forest floor and splattered across the trees. The fight that followed was not a battle, it was a massacre, and the king's teeth realized too late that they were not the hunters, but the prey, that every assumption they had made about this rogue wolf had been catastrophically wrong. Zephra moved through them like a force of nature, her claws slicing through flesh as easily as a hot blade through snow, her teeth crushing bone with sickening cracks that echoed through the clearing, her movements so fluid and unpredictable that none of them could land a solid hit. She was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of black fur and silver eyes and dripping red jaws, and every time one of the warriors thought they had found an opening, she was already gone, already tearing into someone else. Gorvith tried to organize a counterattack, tried to use their numbers and training to overwhelm her, calling out commands and attempting to coordinate their strikes, but she was always one step ahead, always anticipating their moves, always turning their strength against them. She caught one warrior by the leg as he tried to leap over her and slammed him into a tree so hard that the trunk cracked and his body folded in on itself like a crushed insect, then spun and ripped the throat out of another who had tried to attack her from behind. Blood sprayed across her fur, hot and sticky, and she could taste it on her tongue, could feel the thrill of the kill singing through every nerve in her body, and the rage that had been burning inside her for weeks finally had an outlet, finally had a purpose. These warriors had come to kill her on Kale's orders, had come to silence her before she could become a real threat, and she was going to make sure that every single one of them paid for their loyalty to the king who had destroyed her. She tore through them with a savagery that went beyond simple survival, with a fury that demanded not just victory, but complete annihilation, and she made sure that each death was brutal and painful and impossible to forget. One warrior tried to run, his nerve finally breaking as he watched his companions fall around him, but she was on him in seconds, dragging him down and breaking his back before leaving him alive just long enough to feel the agony of his shattered spine before she ended him. One by one, the king's teeth fell, their bodies broken and scattered across the clearing, and soon only Gorvith remained, his own blood dripping from a dozen wounds, his breathing ragged and desperate as he tried to stay on his feet. He had shifted back into his human form, his legs too weak to hold his wolf shape any longer, and he stared up at Zephira with a mixture of fear and disbelief that would have been satisfying if she had any capacity left for satisfaction. "What are you?" he gasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, his hand pressed against a gash in his side that was bleeding far too heavily for him to survive much longer. No wolf should be this strong. No rejected mate should be able to do this. "What did you become out here?" Zephra shifted as well, standing over him with blood dripping from her hands and face, her eyes burning into his with an intensity that made him flinch despite his training and experience. "I am what Kale made me," she said, her voice cold and empty of mercy, each word carefully chosen to make sure he understood. "I am the monster he created when he threw me away, when he rejected a bond blessed by the gods themselves, because he thought I was too weak to stand beside him. I am everything he feared I might become, and I am going to make sure he understands exactly what that means." She reached down and grabbed him by the throat, her grip tight enough to cut off his air, but not quite tight enough to kill him yet, and she leaned in close, so he could see the rage and pain still burning in her eyes, so he could see that this was not over, that this was only the beginning. "Tell your king, if you survive long enough to crawl back to him, that I am coming. Tell him that his elite guard could not stop me, that the finest warriors in his kingdom fell like children before me, and tell him that neither will anyone else he sends. Tell him that the weak little wolf he rejected is going to tear his kingdom apart piece by piece, and when I am done, when he has lost everything and everyone he cares about, I will stand before him and make him beg me for the mercy he never showed me." She released him, and he fell to the ground gasping and choking, blood pouring from his wounds and pooling beneath him, and she turned and walked back into the shadows of the forest, leaving him alive only so he could carry her message back to Kale. Behind her, the bodies of the king's teeth lay in pieces, their blood soaking into the earth, a monument to her fury and a promise of what was still to come. She could hear Gorvith struggling to breathe, could hear him trying to drag himself toward the edge of the clearing, and she knew he would probably die before he reached the kingdom, but there was a chance he would make it, a chance someone would find him and hear his story. And if he did not survive, well, the bodies would speak for themselves, would tell everyone who found them that something new and terrible had emerged from the forest, something that could kill the best warrior Stofung had to offer without breaking stride. The slaughter was complete, but the war had only just begun, and Zephra knew that Kale would not ignore this, could not ignore it, because she had just destroyed the greatest warriors his kingdom had ever trained. And that meant she was no longer something he could dismiss or forget. She was a threat, a real and undeniable threat, and soon he would have to face the consequences of what he had done to her, would have to confront the monster his cruelty had created. Now, what happens when a king realizes that the mate he rejected has become powerful enough to destroy everything he has built? And how will he respond when the monster he created refuses to stop until she has taken everything from him? News of the slaughter spread through the Stofung kingdom like wildfire, carried on the tongues of terrified villagers and whispered in the halls of the royal court, and the fear that gripped the pack was unlike anything they had known in generations. Gorvith had somehow managed to drag himself back to the gates, his body shattered and his spirit broken, and when he spoke of what had happened in the forest, of the black wolf that had torn through the king's teeth like they were nothing more than pups playing at war, the elders had gone pale and silent. Kale himself had stood in the great hall and listened to the report, his face carved from stone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and though he showed no outward sign of fear or concern, everyone who knew him could see the tension in his shoulders, could sense the fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. "One wolf," he said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stared down at Gorvith, who lay on a stretcher surrounded by healers desperately trying to keep him alive. "You are telling me that one wolf, a female who was rejected for being too weak to stand as a proper mate, killed 11 of my finest warriors and left you alive only to deliver a message?" Gorvith coughed, blood flecking his lips, and nodded weakly. "She is not the wolf you rejected, my king. Whatever she was before, she is something else now, something I have never seen in all my years of fighting. She is massive, faster than anything natural, and she fights with a rage that knows no limits. We could not touch her, could not even slow her down, and she tore through us like we were made of nothing." The court erupted in whispers and murmurs, the pack members looking at each other with growing unease, and Kale raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Gorvitha's broken form. "What was the message?" he asked, though from the look on his face, he already suspected what it would be. Gorvith swallowed hard, his breathing labored. "She said to tell you that she is coming, that no one you send will be able to stop her, and that she will tear your kingdom apart piece by piece until you have nothing left. She said that when she is done, you will beg her for mercy." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and oppressive, and Kale's expression darkened until it looked like a storm about to break. He turned away from Gorvith and addressed the assembled court, his voice ringing with authority even though everyone could sense the tension beneath it. "This rogue will be dealt with," he declared, his tone brooking no argument. "I will send more warriors, better warriors, and they will bring me her head. No rejected mate, no matter how strong she thinks she has become, will threaten this kingdom and live to see another sunrise." But even as he spoke, there were those in the court who wondered if words alone would be enough, who had seen the bodies of the king's teeth when they were carried back for burial, who had heard the terror in Gorvitha's voice when he described the creature that had killed his entire team. Zephra had become something more than just a rogue wolf seeking revenge. She had become a symbol of everything the pack feared, proof that even their strongest warriors could be brought down, that even their mighty king might have made a mistake that could cost them all. Thessalie stood beside Kale, her hand resting on his arm, her beautiful face carefully arranged into an expression of concern, but there were those who noticed the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the king. She had been the one who convinced Kale to reject Zephira, who had whispered poison in his ear about weakness and unsuitability, and now the consequences of that rejection were coming back to haunt them all. "Perhaps we should consider negotiating," one of the elders suggested carefully, his voice thin with age and worry. "If this wolf is truly as powerful as Gorvith claims, and if she was once the king's true mate, perhaps there is a way to resolve this without more bloodshed." Kale turned on him with such fury that the elder actually took a step back. "There will be no negotiation with the rogue who has killed my warriors and threatened my throne. She made her choice when she decided to become a monster, and I will not bow to threats from someone who should have accepted her rejection and disappeared." But despite his confident words, Kale could not shake the unease that had settled in his chest, could not forget the flicker of something he had seen in Zephra's eyes on the night he rejected her, that quiet promise that he would regret his decision. He had dismissed it at the time, had thought it was nothing more than the desperate defiance of a broken woman, but now he wondered if perhaps he should have paid more attention, should have made sure she was dealt with permanently instead of simply casting her out. The bond he had rejected still existed somewhere in his consciousness, a faint tug that he had been ignoring for weeks, but now it felt different, twisted and dark, carrying with it a sense of wrongness that made his wolf uneasy. Over the following days, More warriors were sent into the forest, groups of 5 and 6 at a time, all tasked with finding and killing the rogue wolf that had become such a threat. None of them returned. The forest seemed to swallow them whole, and the only evidence of their fate was the occasional body that would be found at the edge of the territory, torn apart and left as a warning. Zephra was making her point clear. She was untouchable, unstoppable, and every warrior Kale sent only added to the body count and the growing fear that gripped the kingdom. Hunting parties stopped venturing into the deep forest. Villagers began staying inside after dark, and the pack that had once been so proud and confident now moved with nervous energy, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting the black wolf to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Kale became more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his chambers, and those closest to him could see the strain beginning to show, could see the cracks forming in his armor of confidence and control. Thessalie tried to comfort him, tried to convince him that it was only a matter of time before Zephira made a mistake and could be brought down, but even she could not hide her own fear, her own growing realization that perhaps they had unleashed something that could not be stopped. The kingdom that had once seemed so strong and unshakable now felt fragile, balanced on the edge of a knife, and everyone waited with held breath to see what would happen next, to see if their king could truly protect them from the monster he had created. How long can a kingdom stand when its warriors fall one by one to a threat they cannot defeat? And what will the Alpha King do when he finally accepts that the woman he rejected has become more powerful than he ever was? Zephra finally emerged from the forest on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed to hide behind clouds, as if even the heavens could not bear to witness what was about to unfold. She walked toward the gates of Stofong Kingdom in her human form, naked and covered in blood that was not her own, her silver eyes glowing in the darkness like twin flames. The guards on the walls saw her coming from a distance and raised the alarm, their voices shaking with fear as they called for reinforcements, and within moments the gates were surrounded by warriors, their weapons drawn and their wolves straining against their human skins. But Zephra did not stop walking, did not slow her pace or show any sign of concern, and when she finally stood before the massive wooden gates that had once marked the boundary between her home and the wilderness beyond, she smiled. "Tell Kale that I am here," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the walls despite speaking at a normal volume. "Tell him that Zephira, the weak little wolf he rejected, has come to collect what he owes me." There was a long moment of silence, and then she heard movement on the other side of the gates, heard whispered arguments and the sound of messengers running toward the great hall. She waited patiently, her arms at her sides, making no threatening moves, simply standing there like a statue carved from darkness and vengeance. The warriors on the walls kept their weapons trained on her, but none of them dared to fire. None of them wanted to be the one who started the fight with the creature that had killed so many of their brothers. Finally, the gates began to open, groaning on their hinges, and Kale stepped through surrounded by what remained of his elite guard and followed by Thessalie and several elders. He was dressed in his ceremonial armor, dark leather and bone plates that made him look every inch the warrior king, and his face was set in hard lines of anger and determination. But Zephra could see the tension in his shoulders, could smell the faint scent of fear beneath the bravado, and she knew that he understood exactly how dangerous this moment was. "You have killed my warriors," Kale said, his voice cold and measured. "You have terrorized my borders and threatened my kingdom. Give me one reason why I should not order every wolf here to tear you apart where you stand." Zephra laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "You could try, but we both know how that would end. Your finest warriors could not stop me, and neither can these. But I did not come here to fight your entire pack, Kale. I came here for you, to make you answer for what you did to me." She took a step forward, and every warrior tensed, but Kale held up his hand, stopping them from attacking. You rejected me in front of everyone, humiliated me, cast me out like I was nothing. You severed a bond blessed by the gods because you thought I was too weak to stand beside you. But look at me now, look at what I have become, and tell me that you made the right choice. Kale's jaw clenched, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret or recognition, but it was gone before Zephra could be certain. I did what was necessary for the kingdom, he said. You were weak, unable to even shift properly, and I could not afford to be bound to someone who would make me look weak in front of the other territories. Zephra's eyes blazed brighter, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I was weak because no one, not you, not the pack, not anyone, believed in me. But the rejection broke something inside me, tore away the part of me that was afraid and uncertain, and what emerged was the truth of what I always could have been if anyone had bothered to see it. She shifted then, her body flowing into her massive wolf form, and even though they had all heard the stories, seeing her in person was something else entirely. She was a creature of nightmares, a beast that seemed too large and too powerful to be real, and the warriors actually took steps backward despite their training. I could kill you right now, Kale, Zephira said, her voice somehow still clear even in wolf form, a trick she had learned during her time in the forest. I could tear you apart and take your throne, could make this entire pack bow to me through fear. But that would be too easy, too quick, and you do not deserve a clean death. So instead, I am going to give you a choice. Kale's eyes narrowed. What kind of choice? Zephra's lips pulled back from her fangs in what might have been a smile. You can accept me back as your mate, can stand before the pack and acknowledge that you were wrong, that I am strong enough and worthy enough to stand beside you. We will complete the mating bond, and I will become your queen, and together we will rule this kingdom. Or you can refuse, and I will leave here tonight and spend the rest of my life destroying everything you have built. I will kill your warriors one by one. I will drive away your prey and starve your pack. I will make alliances with your enemies and bring them to your doorstep, and I will not stop until this kingdom is nothing but ash and memory. The entire assembled pack stood in shocked silence, unable to believe what they were hearing, unable to process the fact that this creature was offering them a choice between accepting her or facing complete destruction. Kale stood frozen, his mind racing, and Zephra could see the war playing out behind his eyes, pride battling against pragmatism, ego fighting against survival. You cannot force a bond, Kale said finally, his voice tight. Even if I agreed, even if I went through with the ceremony, it would not be real if my heart was not in it. Zephira's expression darkened. Then, I suggest you find a way to make your heart cooperate, because those are your only options. Accept me and leave, or refuse me and watch everything you love burn. What will an alpha king choose when faced with a mate powerful enough to destroy him? Acceptance of the bond he rejected, or the slow annihilation of everything he has built? Kale stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on the massive black wolf that had once been the quiet, frightened girl he had rejected, and everyone in the kingdom held their breath waiting to see what their king would decide. Thessalie stepped forward, her face twisted with anger and jealousy, her voice rising with desperation. You cannot seriously be considering this, my king. She is threatening you, blackmailing you into accepting a bond you already rejected. This is madness. But Kale raised his hand, silencing her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of his decision. I will accept the bond, he said, and gasps rippled through the crowd. But understand this, Zephira, if you think this makes you safe, if you think this gives you power over me, you are mistaken. We will complete the ceremony. We will bind ourselves together as the traditions demand, but after that, you and I will find our own way forward. Zephra shifted back to human form, standing before him with blood still coating her skin and her silver eyes burning with triumph and something darker, something that spoke of wounds too deep to ever fully heal. I do not want safety, Kale, and I do not need your love or your approval. What I want is recognition, acknowledgement that you were wrong, that I was always strong enough, and you were simply too blind to see it. Complete the ceremony, bind yourself to me, and then we will see what kind of rulers we become together. The ceremony was held that very night, in the great hall where Kale had first rejected her, and the irony was not lost on anyone present. The High Elder performed the ritual with shaking hands, speaking the ancient words that would bind their souls together, and when the ceremonial blade cut their palms and their blood was mixed, Zephra felt the bond snap into place with a force that nearly drove her to her knees. It was different from before, when it had been new and gentle and full of hope. Now it was dark and twisted, carrying with it all the pain and rage and betrayal of the rejection, and she could feel Kale's emotions bleeding through it. His resentment and his fear, and underneath it all, a tiny spark of something that might have been respect or recognition. When the ceremony was complete and the elder declared them mated before the pack, Zephira stood beside Kale on the platform where the throne sat, and she looked out over the assembled wolves with an expression that dared any of them to challenge her claim. Thessalie had fled the hall in tears, her plans for becoming queen shattered, and many of the elders looked deeply uncomfortable, but no one spoke against it, because everyone had seen what Zephira was capable of, had heard the stories of the warriors who had died in the forest. The days that followed were tense and strange, as the kingdom adjusted to having a queen who had literally killed her way to the throne, and Zephira began the work of transforming herself from a creature of pure vengeance into a ruler who could actually lead. She was not gentle or forgiving, and she made it clear that anyone who challenged her authority would face the same fate as the king's teeth. But she was also fair in her judgments and fiercely protective of those she considered under her care. She trained the warriors herself, pushing them harder than they had ever been pushed before, and though many resented her at first, they could not deny that under her guidance they became stronger and more skilled. She reorganized the hunting territories, established new trade routes with neighboring packs, and proved that the strength she had gained in the forest was not just physical, but mental and strategic as well. Kale watched all of this with conflicted emotions, unable to reconcile the weak girl he had rejected with the powerful woman who now shared his throne, and the bond between them remained strained and complicated, carrying as much pain as it did connection. They ruled together, but slept in separate chambers, worked side by side, but rarely spoke of anything personal, and the entire kingdom could feel the tension that existed between their king and queen. But despite the complications, despite the darkness that had brought them together, Stonefawn began to thrive under their joint rule, becoming stronger and more prosperous than it had been in years. And other territories began to take notice of the Black Wolf Queen who had risen from rejection to claim her place among the most powerful rulers in the land. Zephra stood on the walls of the kingdom one night, looking out over the forest that had transformed her, and she thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The rage that had driven her for so long had not disappeared, but it had changed, had been tempered by time and channeled into something more sustainable. She realized that her story was not just about vengeance, but about proving to herself and to the world that she had always been enough, that the weakness others had seen in her had been an illusion created by their own expectations and limitations. Kale joined her on the wall, standing beside her in silence for a long time before he finally spoke. "I was wrong," he said quietly, the admission clearly difficult for him. "I was wrong to reject you, wrong to judge you based on what I thought strength should look like. You have proven that you are stronger than any wolf I have ever known, and I regret the pain I caused you." Zephra looked at him, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was honesty and the heavy weight of genuine regret. "Your apology does not erase what happened," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It does not undo the rejection or the humiliation or the fact that I had to become a monster to make you see me. But perhaps it is a beginning, a place where we can start to build something real from the ruins of what should have been." Kale nodded slowly. "I do not know if we can ever have what a true mate bond should be, if we can ever move past the darkness that brought us together. But I am willing to try if you are." Zephra considered his words, feeling the bond between them pulsing with complicated emotions, and she realized that she had a choice to make. The same kind of choice that had faced her in the forest when she could have given up and died, or could have risen and become something more. She could hold on to the rage and pain forever, could let it poison everything she touched, or she could choose to move forward, to build something new from the ashes of her old life. "We will see," she said finally, a small smile touching her lips. "We will see what kind of rulers we become, what kind of mates we can be to each other, and whether the bond we were given can survive everything we have put it through. But know this, Kale, I will never again be the weak girl you rejected. I am the Black Wolf, the creature who decimated your elite guard and brought your kingdom to its knees, and that is who I will remain for the rest of my days." They stood together on the wall as the sun began to rise, casting golden light across the kingdom that now belonged to both of them, and though the future was uncertain and their relationship remained complicated and scarred, they had at least found a way to exist in the same space without destroying each other. But one thing is certain, they're both willing to give their relationship a great trial and make things work. And now, the rejected mate had claimed her place through blood and fury, had proven that she was strong enough to stand beside a king, and though the path had been dark and violent and filled with pain, she had emerged victorious, transformed from victim to queen. From nothing to everything. So, do you think a bond that was broken and remade through violence and vengeance ever truly heals? And what kind of legacy will the Black Wolf Queen and the king who rejected her build together from the ruins of what should have been? What do you think? Kindly drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more.